Everybody, it's been a while since I did a video, and usually breaks would occur of me not doing videos because I ran out of ideas. In this case, I've been real low energy for months, and that's the reason why. And it's frustrating because I have now had about a dozen different ideas as far as videos to make, and I haven't done any of them. But I'm going to try today. One of the frustrating things, though, about me doing videos is after I'm done with any particular video I'm doing, I always realize that I left out some information that I meant to include, and it's really frustrating for me when that happens. And I don't think there's any way to avoid it, because I always want to give a certain amount of information or say certain things. And I remember maybe 75% of it. So it kind of gets me down about making videos. But I had this idea for a whole series, actually. And that is regarding kind of my relationship with music and what goes through my head when I listen to music, because it just dawned on me that it's different from most other folks. You could kind of put people into two categories of music. There's the people that just listen to it like in the car because they can't do anything else while they're driving, and they kind of like this song or that band, and they have no idea who's in the band or who's alive, who's dead, or anything about the history of the band. I don't think any of those people would even ever see this video. And then there's, God, my nose is itchy. Oh man. And then there's, the people that would watch this video, and they're more hardcore, serious fans. But it's dawned on me that a lot of my, listening habits, I guess you could call them, are unusual. And it's been like that pretty much since I left high school, since I got out of rock and roll and I started listening to other types of music that I really, with the exception of classical music, because that's especially orchestral classical music, it's a whole different world. But I find it impossible to listen to music apart from classical music where I don't know who's playing, I don't know who's in the on the recording. If it's a band, who's in the band? Is the band augmented by other musicians? When it was recorded? Who wrote the stuff? And I would say I'm obsessed with that to the point that I can't listen to anything that I don't have that information about. So it's kind of like even when I find things on YouTube, if I find a particularly interesting piece of music that I'm listening to, and they don't list anything besides the artist's name, and they don't tell you who's playing on the recording, did the artist do it all by himself, whatever, I'll take that recording and I'll do another search on YouTube for the same thing to see if somebody else has posted that music with that missing information on it, when it was recorded, who else is playing on it, that type of thing. And I know it's crazy. And I've got other tics too that other people don't have, I think. I need to know, like, besides who's in the band, like, and I think about this just about with everything I listen to, but especially with the things that I really like, and that is listening to music. I listen to a lot of older music. And it's like, okay, who's alive that was on this recording? Who's not alive anymore? When did they die, kind of thing. I'm totally OCD obsessed with that. And that more so with older recordings, recordings that are made, I don't know, especially from the 1970s and before. And this past week, now for quite a few, I say months maybe, especially in the autumn and certainly in the winter time, I tend to listen to much more, if not exclusively, electronic music. I've got this thing, it's like a cycle. Every time autumn and winter come around, I just get the desire. I don't intentionally do it, say, oh, it's winter, let me make sure I listen just exclusively to electronic music. It just happens. When the warmer weather comes in mid to late spring and summertime, I get into this more acoustic mode where I want to hear acoustic instruments. But, and it's a little early here for me to get into acoustic music yet because it's still like 30 to 40 degrees in the morning here. So to me, it's still quite cool. You know, we've got a couple days where, the height of the temperature so far has maybe made it to 55 on a good day. But that's like midday, the early afternoon. The mornings are cold. As a matter of fact, I went out to take my garbage out yesterday morning. And I saw white things. I'm like, well, it must be, there must be some tree that is dropping something. And it turned out there was very light snow. Not enough that you would have to shovel or even clean your car off. But looking at all the cars, I saw that there were snow flurries, that the cars had snow on them. Just a light dusting. But it was like, oh, damn, so it's still not technically spring, which means it's generally when I feel the warm weather, it seems to trigger my desire to listen to acoustic music more. But last week I just had this meltdown. All of a sudden one day I just couldn't take listening to, which is strange for me, a single synthesizer note anymore. I just didn't want to hear any more electronic music. That's very, very unusual for me, with the exception of when I go back to my youth, like in the early 80s. And I went through a whole period there where I was pretty much just listening to acoustic stuff. But I just couldn't take any more electronic music. And I flipped, not only just like acoustic, but like all the way early stuff. And I pulled out early jazz stuff. And I mean like 1951, nothing past 1956 that I listened to. And that's all I listened to for days. And it was all Miles Davis stuff. And it just so happened to be that way. It could have been any jazz from that era, but because I have a lot of Miles recordings, I think I might have even more than Tangerine Dream. I have a lot of Tangerine Dream albums, but I got a lot of Tangerine Dream albums that don't get played a lot. A lot of them, got played when I first bought them, and that was it for a few plays. If I combined all the vinyl I have of Miles Davis and the CDs, I probably have more on him than anybody else, including Tangerine Dream. So I have a lot of records back there on the floor actually, and I got nostalgic. Now here's the thing: when you get old, if you're not there yet, or maybe just old in your mind. I got nostalgic not only to hear the Miles stuff that I was buying when I really first seriously got into mainstream jazz. I'm not talking about ECM jazz, I'm talking about mainstream jazz, which I got into after ECM. I kind of went from the prog rock thing to guys like Klaus Schulze, the electronic thing, to ECM jazz, and then to mainstream jazz from there. But that was a very short period of time that all occurred under, like 2 years maybe, from the prog rock to the electronic stuff to the ECM to the mainstream jazz. I mean, it was a very condensed 2 or 3 year period. I was buying albums every week. And so it was in the very late 70s, after getting into ECM jazz, which most of the stuff, or a lot of it, of the ECM stuff was much more acoustic based than the stuff I grew up on, than the rock stuff and the prog stuff and all that kind of thing. So that kind of set me up, the ECM stuff, having a lot of acoustic instrumentation in there, kind of set me up to explore quote-unquote mainstream jazz or mainstream jazz artists. I didn't even pull the first vinyl I got by Miles Davis, which was a kind of compilation called Circle in the Round, which is a great compilation of previously unreleased tracks that came out about 78 or 79, I think. But after I got that, for whatever reason, I got into Miles. And I got into, you know, all those offshoot people that played with him, including piano players like Red Garland and Wynton Kelly that are pretty much forgotten about now. But it turns out that the late 70s were a great time to get into certain mainstream acoustic jazz. And that's because it seemed from looking at my collection, one of these days I'm going to do a collection of just my two-fers, my two-fer vinyls, which most of which I kept, if not all of them. Let me show you. Oh my God, these are heavy. One of the reasons why I prefer CDs, because I'm getting a hernia lifting these. So here's some examples of the two-fer vinyl scene. Now, from all the two-fers I have, which are repackagings of 2 albums of various jazz artists, most of the stuff goes back even into the 1940s, up until maybe the mid-60s from what I've seen. But so what happened is you had a lot of these classic artists, guys like Dave Brubeck Trio. What a great group. Dave Brubeck, a guy named Ron Crotty on bass, who actually died not that long ago. And I wasn't sure about his career. But he was also, Ron Crotty was also an early bassist for the Dave Brubeck Quartet with Paul Desmond. He didn't play, he had left the band by the time they did Take 5, which was the big famous piece in the height of popularity of the Dave Brubeck Quartet. But Ron Crotty, I don't recall when he died because I looked up all this information, but I didn't memorize it. But within the last few years, he was still around and still playing. And, of course, Dave Brubeck on piano. The third guy, interestingly enough, was Cal Tjader, who was the third member of the group, and he played vibraphone and drums as well. So he would alternate between the two. They didn't do overdubbing at the time, so all these tracks had either drums or vibes on them. I think maybe in a couple cases, Cal Tjader might have switched off from one to the other mid-song. But this was an interesting twofer because it brings together 3 what were 10-inch EPs. The EPs, they gave up on them in America up until the late 70s when they started doing it for rock bands again. But I read that they pretty much, it was around 1956 or a little bit after, that they finally gave up on the 10-inch format, at least for jazz. But so this 2-record set has these 3 EPs complete on them of this early Dave Brubeck trio. That's the kind of stuff you would get with these wonderful, wonderful twofers. And the twofer thing, looking at the dates of all the ones I have, seem to start around 1972 and end in 77. I don't have any from before 72, and I don't have any from 78 on. So it's interesting, and it's understandable why the record companies did this, because those original albums, for the most part, most of these are reissues of albums. Those albums had been in print in their original state as single albums for a lot of years, and they probably stopped selling, and they probably let them go out of print for a while. And then decided we could repackage these, do the twofers. And the great thing with twofers, man, I tell you, the late 70s, especially if you're into vinyl, was a great time to get into these mainstream jazz artists because of the twofers. The difference in price at the time between a twofer and a single release was generally $1. So if you had like a new release or a recent album at that time that was like $6.98, you get a twofer for like $7.98. And if there was an older single album, you know, like say something that was over 10 years, you know, it wasn't like a current, quote unquote, current album. Maybe those would be lesser, like $5.99 or sometimes even $4.99 kind of thing. But the two Fers were in general only $1 or $2 more than buying a single album, even an older single album. So you got your money's worth. And you know, there's most of them, not all of them, most of them were just straight reissues of two different albums. Though some of them were just total compilations. I have others which are oddball. There'll be one complete album on one disc, and the second disc would be like a compilation taken, you know, a few tracks from here and there. These are too heavy. Hold on. No editing involved in my videos whatsoever. So, got into these. Here's now the big guy for two Fers, and Prestige Records in particular, which was a real, like, to me, Prestige is the jazz label of the early 50s, at least the early 50s. I probably had more prestige than any other label in terms of the two Fers go. And these were the first time I heard, you know, all of those things that I just showed. I'd never heard them before, obviously. And for all the Miles Davis versions of these albums I have, most of the Miles Davis stuff I have, certainly just about all the Prestige stuff, actually all the Prestige stuff that I have, I sometimes have in 3 different versions. Generally, I'll have the vinyl. I think I might have everything that he recorded for Prestige. He only recorded for Prestige for about 5 years, but back then people would put out 3 albums a year, maybe more. So I have all the Prestige stuff just about on vinyl, I think. Well, I don't even listen to the vinyl anymore. But I have all the Prestige stuff in CD format at least twice. Many of them I have 3 times, believe it or not, on CD alone. So Prestige would do things like Miles' first formal band with John Coltrane on sax and Philly Joe Jones on drums and the great underrated Red Garland on piano and Paul Chambers on bass, who died very young. That was his first working band, his first formal band. The previous albums he made were just a gathering together of whatever musicians he pulled together for that recording session. So he recorded essentially his first 4 or so albums with that working band with John Coltrane in it. And it was like working with the Miles Davis Quartet, steaming with the Miles Davis Quartet, relaxing with the Miles Davis Quartet. So he made 4 albums, and they would package 2 of them together in these wonderful two Fers. So there's the working and steaming, and then the other one is relaxing, and I forget what the title, that 4th title was. Cooking with the Miles Davis Quintet and relaxing with the Miles Davis Quintet. So there's those. It's the first place that I heard them. And probably the first place I heard John Coltrane, I think. And certainly Red Garland. So those 2 were straight reissues of those 4 albums. But there's 4 specifically that I've listened to now every day for a week. And how am I listening to? I'm not playing the vinyl, I'll tell you that. My turntable's defective. It makes a grinding sound when the turntable's turning, so there's something going on internally in there. If I try to play a record, no matter how new the record is, there's a grinding I hear coming through the speakers as if the needle, the whole mechanism, is not tracking correctly. Because the vinyl's not shot. I've got vinyls that I've played once or twice that I play, and I hear this grinding when I first put the needle down. So I know there's something up with that turntable, and I will replace it one day. And also, on top of that, one of the channels keeps on turning itself off. So, you know, I'll have right-left channel, and all of a sudden the right channel is gone. So I don't play vinyl anymore. except in a rare occasion that I've got something on vinyl that has never come out on CD, and I will dust off the turntable and try to get it working just long enough for me to copy that vinyl into the computer and have it in the computer and burn it onto a disc and listen to it from there. All my music, though, when I get a CD, I don't even play CDs anymore. I buy the CDs, copy it into my computer. I got a nice subwoofer on my computer speakers. It sounds better than my stereo system. My stereo system actually only has bookshelf speakers, but the computer speakers actually sound much, much better with that woofer that it's not powerful, but it literally can shake the walls. And that's all I need. So I copy all of my CDs right into my computer and I listen to them from there. So the CDs don't even get played. They get put on the shelf, and I'm one of those guys, I still need to have the physical medium anyway. So what I did is I pulled out primarily 4 of these Miles Davis twofers. And one of them is called Tune Up. And, you know, I've got no good system set up here. These are sliding off of my lap as I speak. Okay. Which is, all this stuff is basically comprised of material from like 1951, and in some cases up to 56, but mostly 51 and 53. Yeah, there's about this one is a real compilation. Sorry for the delay. I'm trying to read the liner notes in here of stuff from about 4 different albums. Sometimes it's very confusing how they chose the material. Other times it's not. In a lot of cases, when there would be a session, recording session, they'd record a bunch of tunes, and instead of just putting all those tunes recorded at that one session on an album, they would put a few sessions on this album, a few tracks from that session on one album, and next year they might put another few tracks from that session on another album, and they would mix up sessions for some reason. So you weren't necessarily getting, say, in 1952, an album full of Miles Davis's 1951, a session that he did. You might get something from 1950 and a couple tracks from 51 and then a couple tracks from 52 or something like that. So they compiled, the original albums were sometimes compiled really weird, and sometimes on the twofers they would actually take all those tracks that were recorded in one session, in like a marathon session, and maybe put them, together chronologically on an album. And even though it looks like it came from 5 different albums, it actually may have come from only one session or 2 sessions. And then other times, they just grab tracks here and there with little logic behind them, maybe. So, this one has sessions, and I did look at all of these to see who played on them and when they were recorded. And, of course, they're just all over the place. But the sessions are all between 1951 and 1956. But when you look at how much Miles Davis recorded in that period, it's a lot. There's a lot of sessions and a lot of music recorded. And a lot of different musicians he played with. Those early albums, those last 2 that I showed, which were the Miles Davis Quintet, are the only 2 in the Prestige twofer that had like a set band that played throughout the whole double record sets. All these others are compiled of different sessions for the most part. Every session had a different grouping of musicians. And what I did, because I got real nostalgic, and this is another quirk of mine. I got nostalgic to listen to. I have 4 sets here that I've listened to, that I built a playlist on my computer and everything, and I've been listening to every day for a week now. So what I did is I took each one of these albums and looked at the tracks. And like I said, I have all these tracks on CD, and they're all in my computer. And I recreated the playlist of each of these albums, even though they're all over the place, in terms of You might have one track from 53, from another from 51, then another track from 53. I basically I wanted to recreate the experience of when I was young, when I was like, 18, 19, 20, and I got these albums for the first time, and I played them, from the vinyl on my stereo, side 1 to side 4. So I created these playlists in my Windows Media Player of each of these compilation albums, and I put the tracks in the order that they appear in the compilation albums, which, like I said, isn't always logical. Side 1 might have a track from, session number 1 in 1951, and then a whole bunch of tracks from 53 and 56, and then side 4 has more tracks from that same session in 1951. So it's a little crazy the way it was arranged sometimes. But however, I recreated the exact running order of me sitting down when I first got these albums in 1978 or 9, whenever, and just playing side 1 through side 4. Of course, the great thing with having it in your computer and listening to that way, you don't have to get up and change the sides. You just listen, boom, 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 right through. All of these came in between 79 and 82 minutes for all of these 4 sets that I've been listening to, like there's no tomorrow. So I did that for all 4 of these Miles Davis twofers, recreating the listening experience for each one in the exact order that they appeared on here, even when it doesn't make logical, chronological sense. And I guess I just wanted to, another one of my quirks, I just wanted to relive that thing from, all those years, like 40 years ago, of me experiencing these albums for the first time when I sat there and there was no computers and, not even cable TV, and just sitting there and listening to the music and doing this, because this is what I love about the twofers and why I won't give these albums up. You can have them after I'm dead. But the liner notes, that was one of the things that the twofers were great for. So I'm going to show you the other 3. Here's one of the few that have a really nice cover called Tallest Trees. This is a real nice cover. Another twofer, especially the back cover. These were all different sessions, different musicians. 1953 and 54, and one track from 1956. These were all taken from 3 different albums, and which is weird because I'm not sure. I think maybe 1 or 2 of the albums might be that album complete, and then a few tracks from the other albums. So this is another one that logic doesn't prevail. Instead of taking 2 full albums and just reissuing them, they seem to take a few tracks here and there, though maybe one of the albums is complete. I'd have to look. But again, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different sessions spread between 53, 54, and 56. And again, I just created a playlist for these, and I listened to them in the exact order that they appear here on this twofer, side 1, side 4, and sat there reading the liner notes as I played them. And this is another different batch of musicians than the previous one I showed. This has Milt Jackson on vibes, Thelonious Monk on piano, Kenny Clarke on drums, Max Roach on drums, John Lewis on piano from the Modern Jazz Quartet, Horace Silver on piano, Art Blakey on drums. Different sessions, completely different bands, and great musicians. Here's one. I don't know which one to show first. The 2 that I've listened to the most are Collector's Items. A bit confusing because there was an album, a full album that came out called Collector's Items, which already, when that came out, was comprised of different sessions. It wasn't just one big session. But that album called Collector's Items, as it originally came out, is disc 1 on this album. And disc 2 is a very short album that Miles recorded in 1955. Was it called Blue Moods? Hold on. Yeah, it was called Blue Moods. And it was an album, a 12-inch album, interestingly enough, that only ran about 26 minutes. And it wasn't recorded for Prestige. And this is the only example where Prestige actually bought the rights to another album. And on the second album on this, they put in full this 26-minute, 6-song album called Blue Moods that was actually recorded for a label that Charles Mingus started. And Miles owed Mingus something for some reason, some session time or something. And so Miles recorded this album with Charles Mingus and Elvin Jones on drums and a vibraphone player too, Teddy Charles on vibes. And Miles didn't record a whole hell of a lot with vibraphone players. I know he recorded with Milt Jackson, one of those things I just showed, but he didn't record with vibes a whole hell of a lot outside of 2 sessions that I know of. And the Blue Moods is an album that I love, by the way. But with it only being 26 minutes, and the only example that I know of where Prestige bought the rights to put that full 26-minute album on here, they also ended up augmenting that second disc with a couple extra tracks. So this one is basically 2 full albums and a couple extra tracks to fill out the running time. So apparently, instead of making that 26-minute album that Miles recorded for Charles Mingus, instead of making that a 10-inch, they made it a 12-inch, and it was an experiment at the time I read where they were trying to get a better, deeper bass sound, I think it said. They were trying for better audio quality. So instead of putting the 26 minutes worth of music on a 10-inch, they put it on a 12-inch. I mean, it sounds good anyway. It sounds just like a really good 1950s session. I don't even think it's in stereo, but I don't think any of these are in stereo, to be honest. This is really before stereo was a thing. So the Blue Moon sounds great, but I don't know that it stands out as sounding a lot different than any well-recorded session. But it was interesting because the only example of Prestige buying another label's stuff in order to put it on there. But this was a particularly good compilation album with the original collector's items, and then all of Blue Moods and a couple other tracks thrown in. So, once again, I created in my Windows Media Audio, I took all 4 sides of this and created the experience of me listening to this album at home for the first time, or like when I first got it, and reading the wonderful liner notes. The other one that I listen to the most is this is in terms of music, to me this cover stands out. A lot of people say this is a shitty cover. I don't know. But, and it really has nothing to do with music, but for some reason it really stands out. And I remember when I bought it, it stood out in the record racks because there's nothing, there's not too many pictures of tractors and digging in the dirt and things like that, on albums anyway. This, and this is another kind of mishmash. Let me see what's on here. Yeah, this is a few different sessions of really, really early Miles stuff. And again, mono, Miles didn't have a working band together. So, it looks like there were, 2 different sessions in 1951, which I guess that's the earliest that Miles recorded for Prestige, because I haven't seen anything on Prestige that predated that. So it's 2 different 51 sessions, and then a 1953 session. And let me see, Miles Davis, and a couple of these tracks were actually also repeated from the Collector's Items album. One of the rare instances where they did that. So, but this one was really good. A lot of good musicians on here. Sonny Rollins, a really young Sonny Rollins, John Lewis and Percy Heath, both from the Modern Jazz Quartet, Walter Bishop on piano, Art Blakey on drums, Al Cohn tenor sax, Zoot Sims tenor sax, Kenny Clark on drums, who was the original drummer for Modern Jazz Quartet, Jackie McLean, alto sax, and Sonny Rollins, I mentioned, 1951, so those are very, very early sessions for him. And one of the other quirks that I have, and here's something that made me feel old, and especially goes with all the Miles Davis twofers that I showed. I looked up every single musician that plays on these. And there's a few musicians even on this that I didn't mention, so there's quite a few different musicians spread out over these 3 sessions. At the time I got these albums, with only one exception, all of the musicians were still alive. All of them. This makes me feel old. There was one musician, the trombone player, Benny Green, I think it is, who plays trombone, on one of the last 2 of these twofers that I showed. Benny Green, the trombone player, had passed away in 1977, which was only about a year or 2 before I bought all of these twofers. So he had, been fairly recently deceased at that point. However, on all these other 6 Miles Davis twofers that I showed, with the exception of Coltrane, who died in 1967, all of the musicians were still alive at the time I got into these. Now, it's a completely different story, and it's really depressing, and this is something that I always kind of fixate on. There is one musician, and one only, out of all of these guys on all of these records, who is still alive, and he only appears on maybe 2 tracks on all of these records, and that's Roy Haynes, the drummer. I forget which album it was. One of the ones I showed, one of the Miles Davis ones I showed, does have Roy Haynes, I think, playing on one session, which is only comprised a couple songs. So it's nice to think that Roy Haynes is still around. But when I look into the time when I first got into these, and I was reading, the liner notes and learning about the musicians. Of course, you didn't have the internet back then. All of these guys are still alive, and they're all gone now, with the exception of Roy Haynes. Another thing that I got into, even though I have these in my room at all times, these records, I don't actually have them in storage in the garage. And I was, listening to these records exactly in the order that they put them on the vinyl. I'm reading the liner notes, and there's this in Dig. This twofer. There's this particularly story that struck me as like, this is I read and I loved, and it's exactly the reason why I love these twofers and I love the liner notes. There's this guy, Doug Ramsey, and I looked him up, and he's still alive, and he still writes and he still reviews jazz. He was a guy that was in the media. He was on television. I think he was like a manager or director in a TV studio on the West Coast somewhere. Jazz writer, he wrote for Downbeat and all the jazz magazines and all that. Wonderful writer. I didn't know anything about him until I just looked him up now. But inside this Dig album, he wrote the story about how he was a Miles Davis fan back in the 50s. And the early 50s. And Doug Ramsey was originally from, I guess, a pretty obscure town in Washington. And he had come to New York. I'm pretty sure it was in New York City. And he was there to see Miles play with his band. And in between sets, Miles would play, and then another jazz musician would go on stage and play, and they would alternate between the two. and it was, I think Teddy Wilson was the other guy. Teddy Wilson had a trio, and he was playing split sets with Miles Davis. Band would go on, and then Teddy Wilson's trio would go on, and then there would be a break, and then they'd alternate again. And so Doug Ramsey was this big Miles Davis fan, and I guess he had gone by himself, and Doug Ramsey was sitting at the bar watching the performances of the two groups, and was watching Miles because when Miles was off stage, he was watching Teddy Wilson play, but then there was a break when neither Teddy Wilson nor Miles was playing, and Miles happened to be walking around the club, and there was an empty seat next to Doug Ramsey, and Miles just sits in the empty seat right next to him. They're like rubbing shoulders. And now Doug Ramsey's like, he doesn't want to, he knows Miles' reputation for being kind of surly, and he just idolizes this guy, so he doesn't want to try to strike up a conversation or anything and, come like a drooling fan, but Miles ends up starting a conversation with him. And they're talking back and forth. And he said mostly not about music, but about other things in the news and the weather and this or that. And he was just flabbergasted and amazed. And the whole time he's having this conversation, which he said maybe went for about 20 minutes with Miles, he's trying not to let on how absolutely in shock he is and how much he idolizes this guy that he's sitting there now having a conversation with. And it's just, it's that kind of thing that you just want to see in a good, liner notes on an album. And you don't see that anymore. And it's weird because all these, CD booklets can have multiple pages, but for some reason they don't seem to be very interested, when they re-release these older archive recordings of really going that deep into putting in detailed liner notes and trying to get a story like that, like that Doug Ramsey had. And I just love it. I don't remember reading. Now, I know I read this. I would have read that when I first got the album. But, just this week when I was sitting there, listening to the music in the playlist and reading all the individual liner notes of each one of these twofers, that just struck me as that's perfect. That's exactly why, why these are actually, in some cases, maybe even better than the single albums that they came from, because the single albums didn't have that historical context to them and the liner notes and that kind of thing, because all these came out 20 plus years after the original sessions. So there's lots of time to kind of sum up how important in the artist's discography these sessions were. So, like I was saying, I have all these sessions in at least 3 different formats. Eventually, they re-released the original sessions on CD, the original albums, as single albums, pretty much exactly like they were on the original LPs that came out, with the original cover art. So there's one, and this is all material that was included in this, in those twofers. And I love the cover. This is the Miles Davis Blue Moods, the one that he made for Charles Mingus's record company that Prestige eventually bought the rights to. Elvin Jones on drums, Britt Woodman on trombone, and Teddy Charles on vibraphone. Here's the original cover for Collector's Items. That was just a 1 LP thing that came. I love that cover. It's the kind of art. I'm glad that they reproduced the albums as they originally came out, at least for the covers of the CDs, because this is the kind of art that it's not fashionable. You don't see it anymore. And it reflects the time period, Blue haze, pretty simple, but again, not the kind of art. This is very 50s, very early 60ish pop art thing. I love it. So, I knew this was going to be longer than I wanted it to be, but sorry. So that's what I've been listening to. I'll probably get into more of my quirkiness when it comes to listening to music in future videos. But at least I got this one done. So if you stuck with it thanks. And if you didn't stick with it, that's okay too, because I know I'm too long-winded. So, hope everybody's doing well. I'm going to sign off now and be back at some point in the future. Maybe. Take care.